In this particular slide set, what I want to do is give you an idea of how challenging it can be to define interactions among pesticides. And I'm going to use peanuts as a case study. So some of the principles I'll talk about here could expand beyond peanuts, but they certainly are important for peanuts and the folks that are trying to manage weeds, insects, diseases, and apply plant growth regulators and micronutrients in their crop. So in doing so, there's a couple of things that affect how well a product performs. And again, this is something that your instructors will have talked about to a great degree. The active ingredient in a formulated material is important. That's what does the actual activity on the pest that you're trying to control and the causal agent of that. The formulation can vary. We have liquid formulations, we have emulsifiable concentrate materials, then we might have dry flowable materials that are that have the same active ingredient, and that can affect some of these interactions. The adjuvant you use, the carrier water quality, whether it's hard or soft water, and then your carrier volume can have an impact, and that's going to vary from pesticide to pesticide depending on what you're trying to do. The efficacy of a product is based in many ways on absorption and translocation and metabolism. There's certainly a race going on once that material gets on a plant or on whatever the pest happens to be. If it could be an insect, it could also be interacting with a pathogen, but how quickly is it absorbed, translocated, and what's the rate of metabolism? How quickly can that plant, whether it's a weed or crop, handle that outside agent that has gotten in that particular plant? It's also, you can have some variation based on the species in the field, the stress of the pest size, pest development, rainfall, humidity, temperature, time of day, and all these are elements that could cause you to have a major interaction or no interaction or a subtle interaction. And other things would be what other products are being put in addition to maybe the 2 you're looking at or 3 you're looking at. What's the rate of the products? You can overcome some of the interactions with increasing rates. And then the order of mixing can have an impact, and that's more of a phenomena related to settling out in a tank and having that physical compatibility. So with compatibility, we're often thinking about what's the impact on the pest we're trying to control, what's the impact on the crop tolerance of that mixture that we're using and the pesticides within, but also a major one is whether or not these materials are physically compatible in the tank even before you come to the field. So one of the ways that we can address compatibility issues if they do occur would be to make sequential applications. Most folks don't want to even hear that, especially if you talk about making an application today and waiting 2 or 3 or 4 days to make a next application. Folks just aren't often going to do that. You can also increase the pesticide rate of the product that's being effective. So if it's a broadleaf herbicide that affects a grass material, if you increase the rate of the grass material, you can often overcome that. There are adjuvants that can make that compatibility much greater, and some of those are sold here in North Carolina. You can actually make timely applications when your pest, in this case weeds, aren't stressed. You can mix a lot of things that in theory would cause an adverse interaction, but when the weeds are small and there's no stress, you will really minimize the adverse interaction. There are some compatibility agents that could be added and also some tank conditioners, and those would be available through distributors. So the peanut case study. So if we were to look at peanut production systems, we generally plant in May, but we'll back up into April as well, and we may have peanuts growing in the field all the way through September. We even occasionally will have things in October that need to go well into October. But generally speaking, if you were to look at this particular table, what I'm trying to do here is where I've shaded things in this green color is when you might need to make some type of application for a weed. And that could go all the way from April all the way into August. Generally speaking, our sedges would probably have played out by here. They're just not very competitive, but they could be there before then. Broadleaf weeds and grasses could run all the way really almost into September. We manage thrips early in the season, so there's potential for some mixtures there with herbicides. And then if you look at our other insects, when you get into July and August, corn earworms, corn rootworm, fall and beet armyworms, and spider mites. There's some interactions there. There's some diseases where we might have to control early in the season. Not botrytis, but CBR, Pythium, crown rot. But one of our big emphasis points is early and late leaf spot, stem rot, and sclerotinia blight when you get into July and August, and then on into September. Then tomato spotted wilt. There's really not much that goes on here because we just most of the control areas with cultural practices, and then we have a disease called web blotch. There could be some overlap between those. If you look at things like nematodes, most of those will be controlled in April or May. There are a couple of products now that have fluopyram in them that has activity, and those are some of the earlier, you could use those early post-emergence. But we also have things like nutrients like boron and manganese that are going out at this window as well. There's a plant growth regulator called prohexadione calcium that's used by about half of our growers. So there's a lot of potential interaction, especially if you look at a month like July. We're cleaning up weeds. We're often having an outbreak of insects. We certainly have got on our spray schedule for leaf spot and stem rot. And then we might be putting out things like boron and manganese and beginning our prohexadione calcium application. So there's a lot of room for overlap. Farmers would like to co-apply materials as much as possible. I'm making this presentation in mid-August, and I've gotten questions in the last day or so about mixing 5 or 6 things in the tank. One of those was just a question about whether I should do it, and then I got some images from someone that mixed 5 or 6 things in a tank, and one of those caused a lot of injury. It was probably related to boron, and those other materials might have just caused that boron to have had greater absorption and more damage. So all these are legitimate questions. A couple of years ago, a person was mixing manganese and didn't get that, a dry material, into solution very well, and had to replace all the nozzles. I spent about $10,000 or so re-equipping the sprayer because he just never could get that material pulled out. But it was several things that were mixed together in that sequence. And somebody down the road might have done that and been okay. It just could have been that their water system was different. So a lot of things can be the wild cards in that as well. So for peanuts, kind of focusing back on that, we do have a lot of weeds. Here's some example of Palmer amaranth. That's a big issue with peanuts. Early and late leaf spot. Farmers tend to get on a usually a 5 spray program in spraying every 2 weeks in in July and August and into September. Stem rot is another disease that we can run into with problems. Here's an example of letting leaf spot get away from you, and you can see there's a lot of canopy defoliation, and when you get to about 40% canopy defoliation, you start having major yield losses. And the biggest challenge there is it's like with every epidemic. Once you get to, say, 20% of the canopy with lesions, you probably have 60 or 70% of the canopy that already has an infection, and most of our fungicides can't correct an infection. They're not they're preventive in how they manage the crop. Corn earworm and fall armyworm. I should put in here tobacco budworm. Those are also issues. And if you look at the active ingredients, and then there's multiple products that have the same active ingredient. Just in peanuts alone, there's 19 herbicides, 17 insecticides, 23 fungicides, 2 fumigants, prohexadione calcium. There's a lot of growth stimulants or enhancers that you could get from the distributors. That's part of their line of products, and then foliar fertilizers. So there's a lot of possible overlap. I showed you earlier that there was a lot of overlap between the timing of when materials go out, but there's a lot of products that could go out at that point in time. So post-emergence herbicides, aceflorphin, bentazone, imazapyc, imazethapyr, lactofen, paraquat, 2,4-DB, clethodim, sethoxydim, acetochlor, metolachlor, dimethenamide, diclosulam. I should have Zidua and Anthem Flex listed in here, and I failed to get those put in there, but those are also residual herbicides you could deal with. Our post-emergence insecticides, acephate, the pyrethroids, there's a lot of different formulations of those, indoxacarb, propargite, fenpropythrin, chlorpyrifos, methamil, spinosad, and chloranthotrinoloprol. Should have practiced that one before I made this presentation, but again, very good insecticides to control the heliothione complex and some of the other insects that we would have. Our fungicides, I've grouped these together, and there are some newer ones since I actually pulled these slides together, but copper materials, we don't use those very much anymore, but they're available. And these, like the EBDC, DMIs, QOIs, those are different modes of action, and there's always a number of materials in those. One thing that I'm not showing here, and I would probably add more materials to the list in terms of products that are used, is that most folks now from a resistance management standpoint for diseases are mixing things like QOIs and DMIs or SDHIs and these other materials as they make their applications. Just like we recommend for herbicides is to mix and alternate modes of action. So here's what a typical grower does. For peanuts, they apply PPI pre, early post, mid post, and late post sprays, usually on average 5 sprays maybe in peanuts. Insecticides would be applied at planting, early post for thrips control, probably 60 to 70% of our acreage gets that application of acephate no matter what was used in furrow, and then late post applications for foliar feeding insecticides. Our sprays for stem and leaf spot disease about 5, unless it's a really dry year, and then maybe it's 3, and really wet year or a really delayed year, we might have 6 sprays. Boron and manganese are applied. We don't recommend that those materials go together. There can be some settling in a tank and problems if you put boron and manganese together. So boron will go with one spray, and then manganese will go with another. And then we have maybe chlorpyrifos, which is applied as a granular, calcium sulfate, which is a fertilizer, but it's also a granular. Prohexidine calcium, we might make 2 applications of that, and then fluazanam, which is used for sclerotinia blight control. So those are, you start adding all these up, there's something going on in the field almost every week, and the potential to put a couple of things together is there, and folks would like to do that. So we have done some work with, we had a book chapter a number of years ago, and I can point you in that direction if you're interested, but that's only if you're interested. This is not something, your instructors will not pull anything specific out of there for an exam. We also have a chapter in our peanut production guide that looks into this in a bit of detail. It's generally a set of general recommendations there. So we often talk about those results at our field days and so forth, and again include those in our production guide to make help people make decisions. And I've already mentioned this one time, but here are the concerns that you would have when you start putting multiple things in a tank. I think that probably the most important concern is whether you can get settling in the tank, or if all of a sudden you have a precipitate that falls out because 2 or 3 things got together. That's a huge cleanup. And keep in mind, you might have a sprayer you have a solution in there that's, if you look at the rates that went in the tank, or designed to cover 50 acres, 100 acres, whatever your sprayer can do, and all of a sudden now you've got a couple of buckets that holds that and will not go back in solution. What do you do with that? Increased crop injury is a concern. We see some of that, and I had mentioned an example earlier, but we also worry about reduced pest control. These are things that can be very unpredictable, and we want to really keep from having a problem with any of these. The other thing that you need to keep in mind is where's the target pest. So, for example, fungicides for stem rot or sclerotinia blight, when they're applied with herbicides, the herbicides require adjuvants. The materials for stem rot and sclerotinia blight, the fungicides, are designed to cover the foliage, but in many ways they are designed to move down to the base of the plant where those pathogens begin to start. So when you start using adjuvants to make the herbicides perform better, you actually could make the fungicides perform less effectively on these soil-borne pathogens. So one of the things that we often think about is what are the ramifications of a reduction in control by 10 to 20% or an increase in crop injury by this amount. So in other words, when I'm logistically challenged and I'm trying to cover a lot of ground, maybe I'm willing to take a partial reduction in control. I might not take a 50 or 60% reduction, but I'll take a 10 to 20% reduction in control and maybe a little more injury just so that I can get across all the acres in a timely manner. And again, it goes down to the logistics. And then maybe it's, if I have a failure in weed control or poor weed control and have to go back over 15% out of 500 acres, maybe that's in my farming operation that's better to do than to start doing the sequential applications that I've talked about before. We would often say apply things sequentially if you can, but then most people want to know, well, what's the ramifications if I can't, because it has to fit into my logistics. So one of the things that occurred a number of years ago is there were, and this goes back to not necessarily pesticides used in peanuts, but herbicides and maybe some other pesticides used in other crops. And the question was, when you start getting a registration of material, how do you treat tank mixtures compared to the active ingredient or the individual herbicide by itself? So we were, a lot of folks were solicited in terms of what are your thoughts on tank mixtures, and I provided a letter to the EPA just talking about how challenging that is if you took away the ability for folks to tank mix multiple products. And I think the question is, from a regulatory standpoint, are the materials behaving the same when you mix them as they would if you applied them individually? If you look at registrations, my impression has been historically that those decisions from a regulatory standpoint for a product were made with the individual product by itself. And then tank mixtures, how does that change that? The other thing we often think about is that pesticide mixtures in general can help us from a resistance management standpoint. But I do want to show a couple of ideas here where when we start doing a lot of tank mixing, and this is not just from a loss in control with a tank mixture, but how does it change our thought about being timely with our pesticide applications, and what are the implications for resistance management? So just a question, do tank mixtures promote practices that encourage resistance? And so the idea here is, we know that multiple modes of action in tank mixtures or in sequential applications can be very important from a resistance management standpoint. But we also know that if, at least for weeds and probably some of the other pests we have, if we're late with an application, if the pest is bigger, we can push greater tolerance in that population. And here's just an example. Let's just say I moved into the season and I need to control stem rot and leaf spot, and I'm going to either spray by the schedule or an advisory. I've got corn earworm. I'm going to use economic thresholds for that. Palmer amaranth is in the mix. I might have manganese, and then I might want to spray peroxidodium calcium. This is a very legitimate possibility, and there are a lot of people that are putting multiple things in the tank to address this. So let's say it's July 10th. I'm protected because I made an earlier application, so I'm good here. I have no corn earworms that are showing up, so I'm below threshold here. Palmer amaranth is only 3 inches. Manganese, I do need to make that application, and then I'm not ready for this material. And let's just say I go into this and I know that a week from now I'm going to need to spray for stem rot or leaf spot. So maybe my population of worms is increasing, but I need to get up much higher to get to my threshold, and our threshold for 3 foot for a beak cloth is usually around, it's about 8 per foot, so quite a few on a 3 foot beak cloth. We also know that Palmer amaranth can grow a lot in a week's time. The manganese, probably not a huge critical issue to wait a little bit, but and then we're not ready for this material yet. So what happens is I spray here. I'm at a sub-threshold level, so if I'm really trying to keep from making an application in about 2 weeks, I may go ahead and put the insecticide in because I feel like it's going to increase, but I'm well below the threshold here. For Palmer amaranth, because I waited to make my tank mixture, I'm at 10 inches rather than 3, so when I make the application here, I'm not going to get complete control with almost anything that I use. So when you get less control, when you apply those herbicides to bigger weeds, we tend to push things towards resistance. I'm good on my manganese. July 23rd, this is when I start beginning to reach threshold, so I was early here, but I might have stayed at 2, or it could have dropped off completely, and I wouldn't know by the time I got out here. Or I could have been just early on that. This was early, I killed those, but our biggest flush or infestation was going to occur in late July, maybe into August. So I've essentially wasted an insecticide application here because I wanted to get it all done at one time. Here, I'm in a lot of trouble here if I didn't do something here, and I really needed to do it back here. And then the prohexidine calcium would go out here. And I have seen people push this on the early side, and the last thing you want to do is make that application before the adjacent rows touch. So if you were to look at a summary of research we've done, and I've been in this position for 23 years, and from day one I started doing compatibility work. That was a part of my previous job at LSU, working in other crops, and then in graduate school, and even work here in North Carolina as a master's student. Pesticide compatibility was a big part of what I did, and adjuvants as well. So we learned a lot about post-mixture, so that would be Select or Clethodim plus Blazer, aciflorphin, or Cobra, or an ALS inhibitor, or glyphosate plus chlorimuron, which would be classic, or glyphosate plus reflex. Those materials that are not uncommon to mix. But fortunately, a lot of the herbicides we use in peanuts are used in soybeans, so we for those 1 and 2 and maybe 3-way mixtures of herbicides and other herbicides, we learned a lot from soybeans. We spray a lot of pyrethroids, and a lot of times those have been historically used at low rates. And what we have found in those circumstances is that when you're putting a couple of ounces in a tank, at least with the insecticides, there's a minimal chance that you're going to have some type of interaction. We've learned a lot about fungicides, and we're concerned sometimes, but not every time. And here's just a couple of examples of materials. Chlorothalonil, very popular. These are the strobies, paraclostrobin and azoxystrobin. These will greatly reduce grass control with graminicides. With broadleaf herbicides, we tend to not see a big issue. Boron and manganese have minimal impacts on pest control, although depending on what you're mixing with, especially if it's a herbicide with a crop oil or surfactant, you can increase the absorption of something like boron, and then there's some concern about increased phyto from boron. One of the other things that we found is, so mixing 2 things together, maybe 3, is a question, but now we get 4 and 5 and 6-way mixtures, or products in a mixture. How do we handle that? And what we found in a lot of that work, and for anybody that wants more detail, I can point you in that direction. We tend to have one major component when there is an issue, and there's not this compounding. So it's maybe I get a 30% reduction with this material, say with grass control, and then if I had another material that reduced it 5%, or we didn't see this going from 30% to 0 when we kept adding a little bit more and add this one versus this one and so forth. And in many cases, even with these 4 and 5-way mixtures, our reductions in control was often less than 20%. And the question there is that biological and practically significant. Certainly sometimes there was one dominant player that would reduce control 50 or 60%, but most times we would only have about a 20% reduction if you looked at many of these combinations that we had. And so with that being said, we have and other universities have invested a lot of time in tank mixing. We can predict some of that. We've got pretty good information on many of our 2 and 3-way mixtures. We may not know all the responses to the 4 and 5-way mixtures, but we know a lot about those as well based on some of the early work. Now, one of our bigger challenges is that new materials come on the market, different formulations come on the market, so that's a whole new area to study. The distributors have their own lines of growth growth stimulators, and we know very little about most of those, especially when you start getting in an organized study to look at it. So there's some limitations there. But all in all, we've got a pretty good feel. We've got a lot of possible combinations in peanuts. I would say compared to most of our agronomic crops, we have more potential tank mix partners than most of the others. And we've learned things in peanuts that could apply when those questions come up in the other crops as well.